Welcome friend to this session of factory patterns. In this session we will try to understand what are factory patterns. We will try to get the fundamentals. We will also make a code walkthrough so that we can actually apply factory patterns to live projects. So the first thing, factory patterns, they belong to the type of creational pattern category. So it helps us to solve problems which are revolving around architecture of creating objects. We'll try to see what exactly are the problems revolving around creating objects from the architecture point of view. As the name suggests that it's factory, so it means that it constructs and creates something. So basically over here it helps us to create objects. So let's understand that why exactly we would need factory pattern as such. See above code, which you can see you can see the above code in a video, where you can see that there's a client. The client takes in an invoice type. So if the invoice type is 1, it will create a CLS invoice with header. So this is a class which he will create and give it to the client. And if the invoice type is 2, it will create CLS invoice without headers. Now this is the requirement here is basically, you can say the client is trying to take up from the user that what type of invoice he wants to use, and depending on that he creates the objects. Now there are two big issues which are related to this code. The first issue is that there are a lot of scattered new keyword. So if you look at back, you'll understand that there is a new keyword here, there's a new keyword there, and then again if there is one more if condition, then you will have one more new keyword. So then you can say that you can say that that because of this new keyword scattered across the client code, your client code complexity increases very much drastically, and this also leads to the maintenance problems associated with the code. The second problem is that the client is aware of all the invoice types. That means the client is, because as he's using the new keyword, he's aware that okay, there is a CLS invoice with header concrete type and there is a CLS invoice without header concrete type, and tomorrow if he adds one more concrete type, let's say CLS invoice without headers, or we say with footers, then he has to know that this kind of type exists. So means we cannot add new types without informing the client. So let's iterate. Two big issues with the code: lot of new keyword which actually increases the complexity of your client code. Second, the client is aware of all the invoice types, so if you want to add a new concrete type, you have to again recompile your client. So how do we solve this problem? The answer is factory patterns. Okay, so here's the architecture, or here's the way, I'll say the approach how factory patterns are implemented. The first problem, lot of scattered new keyword. So let's solve that first. So that can be solved by introducing a class CLS factory invoice, and this class basically takes in an invoice type, and depending on the invoice type you'll either create CLS invoice with header and CLS invoice without header. With that, all the new keyword from the client are removed. Great. So our first problem is solved by introducing the factory class. The second problem, and which is very crucial and important, that client is aware of all the invoice types. So what we do is that all the concrete classes like CLS invoice with header, CLS invoice without header are inherited from an interface called as iInvoice, and the client always points to this iInvoice. So tomorrow if I add one more class here, it doesn't really mind to the client, because the client only knows about the iInvoice. So you can say that with that we have broken the complete link between the client and the concrete classes. So we have solved both the problems. So the first problem of new keyword we have solved by introducing the CLS factory class, and the second problem we have solved by the second problem of the client knowing the concrete classes we have solved by using interfaces. Now let's look at a sample code, that how exactly it looks like. So here's my sample factory class. You can see the factory sample project, and this is in .NET 2005, and you can get this code from the download. If you're using a subscription login, you will get it from the download, and if you're using a DVD, you can get it in the DVD in the source code folder. So here's my factory invoice class, which actually takes in an invoice type, and then depending on the invoice type it gives out the CLS invoice with header or CLS invoice without header, but it always returns a type of iInvoice. And here are both of my classes, CLS invoice with header and CLS invoice without header, and both of this class basically inherit from interface invoice. and here's my interface invoice. So my interface invoice basically stands in between the client and the concrete classes. So with that, if I add a new class here, right, it doesn't really mind to the client because he's always pointing towards invoice interface. The second, you will see that the new keyword problem is solved by introducing the CLS factory invoice. So now if you look at my client code, it's very simple. What it does is it says, okay, enter the invoice type. It takes the invoice type. It says to the factory, please tell me the invoice type. And here we have put the reference of the interface rather than the actual concrete classes. So with that, the client, that is the client project, is never aware of the concrete classes. So take what invoice type, take the integer number of which invoice type you want to create. Tell the factory, please give me that invoice type. Always point the invoice type using the interface and call the necessary method, that is print over here. So if you run this, it's pretty simple. Say 1, it prints invoice will be printed with headers. If I put 2, it will say that invoice will be printed without headers. So that's how the factory works. I hope that you were able to understand practically how factory works. The only point always to remember is the two problems, new keyword and the interface and the concrete classes awareness to the client, solved by introducing a interface and a factory class. And then you can always remember the code, how it was implemented. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, even if it's a silly question, don't shy away from shooting us a mail at questpoint@questpoint.com. If you think that this video was not to its mark and it needed really a lot of other things, you can always mail us, and we'll definitely try to improve on the same.